Hello everybody, it's Kirsty. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. I apologise if you have to adjust the volume. I'm having a very hard time hearing today. Well, since yesterday actually, it's gotten worse. So I apologise if my voice goes down lower or higher, but I'm going to try and max out the volume on this so you can hear it. Okay, what we're going to do today is interesting. We're going to look at 3 serial killers. We're going to look at Fred West from Gloucester, the House of Horrors, Fred and Rose West. We're going to look at Jeffrey Dahmer, and we're going to look at Dennis Nilsen. Now, if you can see, we'll look at these a bit closer shortly, but the reason why I brought these 3 up in particular was they all have very different birthdays. Fred West was born in September. He has a 19-degree Libra ascendant. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in May. He has a 19-degree Libra ascendant. Dennis Nilsen was born in November, all different years, and he has a 19-degree Libra ascendant. So that is fascinating to me that these all have the same degree ascendant. They are all serial killers, and something that some may know and some people may not, but I actually have a little bit of a tie with Fred West, because this is the House of Horrors, or 26 Cromwell Street, and I grew up in this house over here. There used to be a church in between this, and I grew up on Cromwell Street next door to Fred and Rose West. Now, the family has no ties, but we did know of them. They were around the town and people knew who they were, etc. Fred West came off as a very nice person by all accounts. I was only young, so I don't remember, of course. Unfortunately, my mother and her sister knew a couple of the girls that were taken. So that's Fred West and Cromwell Street. So first of all, we're going to look at Fred West because, well, it's because it's where I grew up and he was my next door neighbour. So let's look at Fred West. This is Fred West. That's the house, 25 Cromwell Street. So I'll just read Wikipedia. He committed suicide on the 1st of January 1995 after he got caught. Coward. Rose West is still in prison. Okay, so Fred and Rose West. Well, Fred West was a serial killer who killed at least 12 people between 1967 and 87 in Gloucester. The majority of the killings were with his second wife, Rose West, which is this horrible lady here. All the victims were young women. At least 8 of these murders involved the West's sexual gratification and included rape and bondage and torture. They were awful, horrible people. They buried the bodies of the girls in their cellar and in their garden, and Fred actually killed a couple of people by himself, including his own children, and together they killed Charmaine West, which was Fred's stepdaughter, but Rose murdered her. So it's a shocking state of affairs. I remember I was in Australia by the time they got caught in 1994, and I remember watching it on the news and watching them dig up the garden and finding it unbelievable that there were so many girls in the garden. Now, both of these people, Fred and Rose West, had bad childhoods. Rose West especially had it pretty bad. Fred was one of 8 children, 6 who survived, but Fred was his mum's favourite. So there's a little bit of a difference there. Now, he did have trouble learning. He also actually received a hit on the head, which is something to note with serial killers. When things happen, they often get a hit on the head. So he got hit in the head. Yeah, that's it. Shortly after his 17th birthday, he bought a motorcycle. 2 months later, suffered a fractured skull, broken arm, broken leg, etc. He was unconscious for 7 days and walked with braces. 2 years later, he suffered a further head injury when a girl he groped on a fire escape punched him, which made him fall to the floor. So he had 2 head injuries. Now, that doesn't mean that because you get a head injury you become a serial killer, but it certainly doesn't help. So we've got a timeline here of victims from 67 through to 87. But what I want to do is look at his natal chart and see what the difference is between him, Dennis Nilsen, and Jeffrey Dahmer, that all have the same 19 degrees Libra rising. So let's have a look at his chart. Okay, so we have Fred West's natal chart here, 19 degrees Libra rising. We're going to look at the angles here because they're the things that will change. This angle going here, it's at 25 degrees of Capricorn, and look at that, his moon is right there conjunct at 24 degrees of Capricorn. So immediately, straight off the bat, I can see that he has an overprotective mother. That's Capricorn and the moon. The moon is the mother, Capricorn is overprotective. And it being down here on the IC, and then the sun over here in the 12th house hidden away, and the moon aspecting Saturn and Saturn aspecting the sun, so we've got the father there. So we have a strict disciplinarian father and an overprotective mother. But okay, so just note there, 25 degrees on the IC of Capricorn. So Libra, he is ruled by Venus. Venus is in Scorpio in his 2nd house, and that is self-worth. Venus is women in our lives and love, etc. And the 2nd house being self-worth. Now, Venus being in Scorpio, it tends to be a person that is very over-sexualized. Not always, of course, but it can represent an over-sexualized person, somebody who deems sex as very important. And I believe that he did, because it was tied into his self-worth and his the values he held about himself were tied into this sexual gratification. So that's how he sort of utilized his Libra ruling Venus. It's all about him and what makes him feel better, and his choice of killing the people who he killed was girls. So we keep that in mind as well. He preferred to kill girls. Now, what we see over here on the 7th house, so that's him. He's Libran rising, right? Now, opposite that, so his relationships and how he sees other people is Aries. And on top of that, we've got Mars conjunct, which is the ruler of Aries, conjunct this 7th house. So it's very much him against other people that may have more power than him. So it sort of makes sense, actually, that he chose Rose West. She is she's a really, really strong woman, and that shows me here that he's picked a strong woman. See, the 7th house represents our partners as well. So I think for the serial killers, it's a dichotomy. I mean, Libra is where Aries should be. So naturally, it's in the wrong position. Aries is naturally the 1st house, but it's opposite that. So it's almost as if right from it is as if right from the minute that you're born, you're starting off on the wrong foot. Now, I myself have a Libra rising at 22 degrees, but my Venus is in the 9th house in Cancer. It plays out very differently, and I don't have this going on here. So something that I can see here is Mars is making a pretty tight square to the moon. Okay, so what that shows me, the moon is his mother, and his mother is overprotective. The square is a challenge with relationships and strong women, and that actually is quite indicative of him choosing his victims as well, to me. Now, he has Saturn, death, in the 8th house of death, conjunct Uranus, so death, sudden death to him is nothing. To do what he did to those girls, to him, is really nothing. And I can say that because there's a grand trine here with Neptune, which is delusions and everything that he was, basically, with the moon here. So he's definitely got mother issues, father issues, control over women, and then delusional thinking on top of it. He has Mercury in the 1st house, so one would be led to think that he's actually an intelligent person, but he didn't do very well at school. He wasn't very intelligent. And this dotty line here is an inconjunct, and that's to Uranus. So when Uranus and Mercury are aspecting together like that, there's a disruption in learning. So it shows us that. What I also see from this is he's got a very strong Mars, obviously. The moon is in the 3rd house of vehicles. So emotionally, he was affected when he had his motorcycle accident and hit his head. I truly think that. So that's not only his mother, it's his emotions and how he responds to things. It's in the 3rd house of vehicles. So when he was on that motorbike and had such terrible brain injury, which is represented by Aries and Mars, see this square here, it's sort of triggered off this, what I believe, his becoming a serial killer. So it's hard for me to say, but it's almost to me like a combination of nature, nurture, and head injury and chemical imbalance. The more I study serial killers, the more I learn about these things, the more I see that everything applies. And obviously you can't just look at a natal chart. If you look through my old videos, I've done Ted Bundy and all of the times when he actually killed people, so you can see transits and progressions. So this is just looking at these natal charts. Okay, so let's have a little look at Jeffrey Dahmer and see what's different about him. There's some strange birds out, so there, you'll hear some weird birds. Okay, here we have Jeffrey Dahmer. Everyone knows who Jeffrey Dahmer is, I'm sure. That's Jeffrey when he was young. That's when he was in court. He's dead now. He was killed in prison. But let's have a look at his natal chart. Before we look at his natal chart, we'll see how many people he killed. So he murdered men, 17 men and boys, from 1978 to 1991 in Milwaukee. There he is. He's a big guy, 6 foot something. He was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, psychotic disorder, but was found to be legally sane at his trial, which I find weird. I don't think he was sane. In my mind, he was actually extremely insane. His reasoning for killing these men because he loved them and wanted to keep them forever is insanity. So that's just my opinion. I'm not sure why they didn't see that he was insane, especially with all those disorders. Okay, let's look at his chart. Okay, so this is Jeffrey Dahmer's natal chart. He was born on the 21st of May 1960 at 4:34 p.m. in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And as you can see, just zoom in here. Oops. Don't zoom in too much. He has 19 degrees of Libra rising as well. So the ruling planet that rules Libra is Venus, and over here we have Venus. Venus is in Taurus in his chart. It's in the 8th house of death, along with the Sun, which is at 0 degrees of Gemini, so he just made it into being a Gemini, and Mercury as well, all in the 8th house of death. So because we've got Venus, it's actually making a quincunx to the ascendant here as well, so it's tied into how the world sees him. This Venus is close to the sun, and the sun is men. So this shows me that there's the preference for men. Then close to that is Mercury, which is younger boys. So that's what that shows as well. Fred West had it just sitting by itself in the 2nd house there in Scorpio, which was that very sexualized part of him. Over here, Jeffrey Dahmer equates how people see him, so how people that love him, or he thinks love him, or he wants, he sees them, well, there's no nice way to say it, but being deceased is the best way for him to be in love. So this Venus ruled Libran ascendant once again is in a really critical and horrible position. Now, on the last chart, Fred West, he had Mars sitting right on top of this Aries descendant. Jeffrey Dahmer has the moon, so he's got the moon in Aries. That's rashness and acting too fast, not thinking things through, and it's about me, I am. So his emotions were geared towards himself. Now, I know his history with his mother and father. His father his father's the Sun and Saturn. That's the way I see it. Close to the IC. Remember, Fred West's moon was right here. But Jeffrey Dahmer's Saturn is here. So his father was actually the overprotective one, and his mother was not, how do I say this? She wasn't there for him. I know that from learning what I know about Jeffrey Dahmer. So his mother and his emotions are related to how he sees other people. Now, I'm not saying that his mother's responsible for his killing people. That's not true. But we do need to look into the mother and father when we're looking at charts like this. And I like to see Saturn as the father. It's just something that I look for. And we'll note here that the moon and Saturn are squaring each other. So there's difficulty in communicating with mum and dad. So I know that to be true because they actually split up, and Jeffrey's father moved on, and Jeffrey went and moved in with his grandmother. So his mother had issues, and his father stuck by him and did until the very end, actually. So what else do we have here that's harsh? So his sun is at 0 degrees in the 8th house of death, and it's squaring Pluto in the 11th house of goals, hopes, dreams, friends. So Pluto is destruction and transformation. In fact, this Pluto sun here reminds me very much of what he'd done to people, which was tried to zombify them to keep them alive. So Pluto is very closely squaring his sun, which is a shame. It's really coloured his whole life. This Pluto is really strong here. Pluto makes a trine to Jupiter, so Jupiter is excessive, bigger, so it made the desire for destruction bigger at this trine. It made it easier for him to act on the feelings that he had deep inside. Now, he used his hands to kill most people, and he has Taurus on the 8th house and Venus in the 8th house and Mercury in there as well. That's our hands, and that was his preference. He preferred to use his hands, but unfortunately and awfully he took to using tools to try and make some of his victims into zombies by pouring bleach and horrible things into their heads. So that I see here, Mars in Aries, it can be quite angry. So it's possessive, it wants the men, and it's in conjunct with Neptune in the 1st house. And as I always say, Neptune is deception and not thinking straight. Neptune is escapism, all the things that alcoholism, drug addiction, all those things. He was a drinker, so that shows us this. Drink was important to him throughout his life. Neptune in the 1st house, he was a heavy drinker. That in conjunct to Mars in the 6th house of health in Aries not only shows me that there was possibly a trigger where he's also hit his head as Fred West did, but that his anger is triggered off by the alcohol. Okay, so that's a cursory look. Let's have a look at Dennis Nilsen. Okay, here's Dennis Nilsen. He's gross, horrible person to look at. Born on the 23rd of November 1945 and died on the 12th of May 2018. He was a Scottish serial killer and necrophiliac who murdered at least 12 young men between 1978 and 83 in London. So his preference was young men as well. Convicted at the Old Bailey of 6 counts of murder and 2 attempted murder, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years. In his later years, he was incarcerated at a maximum security prison. So his victims would be lured to 2 addresses that he used, and then he strangled them, sometimes accompanied by drowning. Following each murder, Dennis Nilsen would observe a ritual in which he bathed and dressed the victim's body, which he retained for extended periods of time. Jeffrey Dahmer also did the same thing. Before dissecting and disposing of the remains by burning on a bonfire or flushing down the toilet. That's so disgusting, isn't it? I can't believe that. So he liked to dress up the bodies. Now, what was going on in this necrophiliac crazy ass mind? Let's have a look at his chart. So here we have Dennis Nilsen's chart. Now I'm going to zoom in, go down a bit. 19 degrees Libra rising again, 27 degrees Capricorn this time, a couple of degrees away. So Fred West was 25, Jeffrey Dahmer was 23, and Dennis Nilsen's 27 degrees of Capricorn on the IC. Okay, so first of all we look to Venus because that's the ruler of his ascendant. His Venus is in the first house, conjunct the second house cusp. Remembering Fred West was just over this side, in Scorpio, the very same. Now, interestingly, Dennis Nilsen also has a 0 degree sun, like Jeffrey Dahmer. So that's just something to note. So this Venus in the first house here, why is it that he was more interested in young men than young women? Because Venus is sort of by itself, it's in the first house. It would make sense that it would be young women that he would target. But with a little bit of history, I'll explain some things. But first of all, let's see this. See, there's a square here from Venus to Pluto. Pluto in Leo and Mars in Leo. Mars in Leo is never good. It's never good when you've got issues like this. Sorry, the dogs. So, just a little history. Dennis Nilsen got on very well with his mother until a little bit later on in his life where he felt that she was overprotective. And just a little bit too much, and that shows with the moon in Cancer, which is the mother there, conjunct Saturn, which is authority. So mum is restrictive. Now, interestingly, Dennis Nilsen really loved his grandfather, and his grandfather had a heart attack and died out at sea. Okay, so Saturn is our grandfather as well. So I feel as though there's some blame towards his mother in terms of what happened to his grandfather, but aside from that, it affected him greatly. So not long after that, he himself actually nearly drowned. So if you remember, his MO, his method was to strangle. So that the 8th house of death is Taurus, strangulation, and Venus shows the strangulation. Then we have Neptune hidden away in this 12th house. So in his subconscious, drowning was so scary for him, and the fact that his grandfather died out at sea, it embedded into his psyche. Now, something else that's interesting, and as a reason why he wasn't killing young women, was when he was 15, he realised he was gay. And we can see that there's a connection between the moon and Uranus, and that can show us sometimes homosexuality. So his preference was young men. Now, young men in his chart here are represented by Mercury. It's in the 3rd house and opposing Uranus, which is in the 8th house of death. So Uranus is sudden endings and sudden changes, and Mercury is young men. Now, not only that, we have the dotted red line, so we have an inconjunct from Venus to Uranus. So his sexuality was askew. It was, I mean, not being a homosexual, I don't mean that. That wasn't askew. But in his head, it was messy. It wasn't that he was just gay. he had resentment, deep resentment and anger issues, which is this Mars, Saturn, Moon here over the MC, towards his stepfather and then eventually his mother. Interestingly, he also joined the armed forces like Jeffrey Dahmer did as well. And that's shown by Saturn up on the MC here. That's that authority. He also, I believe, joined the police force. So it's a shame that he turned out doing what he did, because it actually shows that he would have made a really good policeman. This Saturn conjunct the MC here is, even though it's detrimental, Saturn in Cancer, it's good for detective work. And the conjunction to Mars here and the Moon would have really helped him in this instance. So it's the old fated thing of, you know, he sliding doors. He could have made a choice, but he chose to do something different, and that choice was to kill people. So he has a lot of hidden stuff in that 12th house there. So definitely a lot of deep repressive memories that I believe stem from the near drowning, and his grandfather, the death of his grandfather, which then stemmed on to him eventually killing young boys. So let's have a quick look at all three again and see any distinct similarities or differences. Okay, so just looking for some similarities, we've got Fred West here. Obviously they all have the same ascendant. Now Fred West's moon is in Capricorn, Dahmer's moon is in Aries, and Dennis Nilsen's moon is in Cancer. There's no real anything there that shows a pattern. Dennis Nilsen's sun is at 0 degrees Sagittarius. Dahmer's sun is at 0 degrees Gemini. There's the mutability happening here. Fred West's sun is at 5 degrees of Libra. So we've got 2 at 0 and 0. These are the 2 that killed young men. 0 degree suns. Now, Mars. Mars is anger, so it shows us a lot. Fred West had Mars on the 7th house in Aries. Jeffrey Dahmer had Mars in the 6th house in Aries, and the moon. Nilsen only had the 7th house cusp and the 6th house cusp in Aries. His Mars is in Leo. They are all in fire signs. So that's interesting to note. So the same aspects we have are aspects between Mars and Neptune, so anger and delusion. Fred West has it in conjunct between the two. Jeffrey Dahmer has an inconjunct between the two, and Dennis Nilsen has a sextile between the two, so an easier aspect. So Jeffrey Dahmer and Fred West. So okay, this is a very wide quincunx for Fred West, but it's very close for Jeffrey Dahmer. Personally, I think this is one of the things that shows me that Jeffrey was insane and these other two weren't. Neptune in the 1st house, in conjunct Mars very closely, 7 and 8 degrees. That is a form of insanity to him in his chart. These guys don't have it. So if you were to give me these charts and say which person is legally insane for court, obviously I couldn't do it because that would be silly, but if I was to do it, I would definitely say it would be this person here, if I didn't know who it was. And I do know who it is, and I do believe that he was insane. So they all have those aspects. Now, what other aspects can we note? So Fred West, the sun is trining Uranus, Jeffrey Dahmer. The Sun is trining nothing, and the Sun here is trining Mars. So the Sun doesn't really fit in there, apart from we've got a whole bunch of mutable suns. The interesting thing, I think, with all of these is the angles. Fred West has the Moon, which is his mother, and on the 4th house cusp, the IC. Jeffrey Dahmer has Saturn, which is father, on the IC. Dennis Nilsen has mother and father on the MC, opposite the IC, which shows a distinctly harder relationship between his parents, actually, and than these two. So yeah, that's where I'll leave it for now, but it's interesting. I thought you would find it interesting that all of these were 19-degree Libra and the same angles. They all have Taurus on the 8th house of death. They all have exactly the same house cusps all the way around. And these aren't the only ones. I do actually have a whole bunch more, and I'm going to go through those next time. So thank you for watching. I hope this enlightened you a little bit on some things. If it didn't, then at least you've learnt that I lived next door to Fred West, which is a shitty claim to fame, but hey, nonetheless, I did. Okay, take care everyone, and talk to you soon. Bye.